Chapter 21 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 21, Congress. The 37th Congress, chosen at the presidential election of 1860, met in special session on the 4th of July, 1861, under the call contained in President Lincoln's proclamation of April 15, and the House was organized by the election of Galusha A. Grow of Pennsylvania as Speaker. The Senate had already been organized at the inauguration of Mr. Lincoln for its customary session to confirm presidential appointments. By the absence of members of both branches from states in rebellion, they were reduced in numbers nearly one-third. A striking simplification of party relations was also manifested. The 36th Congress had been divided into 4 parties or factions. Then Republicans were in a minority. Now they had a decided majority in both branches, and the Northern Democrats, instructed by the almost universal war feeling in the free states, joined in all necessary war legislation. The new Congress, therefore, may be said to have consisted of simply a war and union party upon principal measures of legislation. Upon subjects connected with slavery, this again divided itself into an anti-slavery majority and a conservative minority. The effort of this minority was not, as in former days, aggressively to extend the institution, but simply to prevent its being weakened or destroyed in the states. The temper and spirit of discussion were in refreshing contrast to the long factional wrangle which had culminated in war. A few members yet suggested agencies for compromise. 1 or 2 from border slave states indulged in malignant censure of the administration. However deplorable it was that even a slight leaven of disloyalty or indifference should be found in the American Congress, its evil effects were for the time being completely neutralized by the conspicuous examples of devoted loyalty from the same communities and classes, such as that of Andrew Johnson of Tennessee in the Senate, and of the Venerable John J. Crittenden from Kentucky in the House, and others prominent in field and council, giving their whole soul and strength to the cause of the Union. Perhaps the most striking feature of President Lincoln's first message to the new Congress was his simple and direct appeal to the people to defend their Constitution and government. Only a few paragraphs can here be quoted to indicate its general tenor. Reciting the various stages of the rebellion and the action of the government in calling out an army to defend the Union, he continued, "It is now recommended that you give the legal means for making this contest a short and decisive one, that you place at the control of the government for the work at least 400,000 men and 400 millions of dollars. That number of men is about 1/10 of those of proper ages within the regions where apparently all are willing to engage, and the sum is less than a 23rd part of the money value owned by the men who seem ready to devote the whole. A debt of 600 millions of dollars now is a less sum per head than was the debt of our Revolution when we came out of that struggle, and the money value in the country now bears even a greater proportion to what it was then than does the population. Surely each man has as strong a motive now to preserve our liberties as each had then to establish them. It might seem at first thought to be of little difference whether the present movement at the South be called secession or rebellion. The movers, however, well understand the difference. At the beginning they knew they could never raise their treason to any respectable magnitude by any name which implies violation of law. They knew their people possessed as much of moral sense, as much of devotion to law and order, and as much pride in and reverence for the history and government of their common country as any other civilized and patriotic people. They knew they could make no advancement directly in the teeth of these strong and noble sentiments. Accordingly, they commenced by an insidious debauching of the public mind. They invented an ingenious sophism, which, if conceded, was followed by perfectly logical steps through all the incidents to the complete destruction of the Union. The sophism itself is that any state of the Union may, consistently with the national Constitution, and therefore lawfully and peacefully, withdraw from the Union without the consent of the Union or of any other state. The little disguise that the supposed right is to be exercised only for just cause, themselves to be the sole judge of its justice, is too thin to merit any notice. With rebellion thus sugar-coated, they have been drugging the public mind of their section for more than 30 years, and until at length they have brought many good men to a willingness to take up arms against the government the day after some assemblage of men have enacted the farcical pretense of taking their state out of the Union, who could have been brought to no such thing the day before. Much is said about the sovereignty of the states, but the word even is not in the national Constitution, nor, as is believed, in any of the state constitutions. What is sovereignty in the political sense of the term? Would it be far wrong to define it a political community without a political superior? Tested by this, no one of our states, except Texas, ever was a sovereignty, and even Texas gave up the character on coming into the Union, by which act she acknowledged the Constitution of the United States and the laws and treaties of the United States made in pursuance of the Constitution to be for her the supreme law of the land. The states have their status in the Union, and they have no other legal status. If they break from this, they can only do so against law and by revolution. The Union, and not themselves separately, procured their independence and their liberty. By conquest or purchase, the Union gave each of them whatever of independence and liberty it has. The Union is older than any of the states, and in fact it created them as states. Originally, some dependent colonies made the Union, and in turn the Union threw off their old dependence for them and made them states such as they are. Not one of them ever had a state constitution independent of the Union. Of course, it is not forgotten that all the new states framed their constitutions before they entered the Union, nevertheless dependent upon and preparatory to coming into the Union. Unquestionably, the states have the powers and rights reserved to them in and by the national Constitution, but among these surely are not included all conceivable powers, however mischievous or destructive, but at most such only as were known in the world at the time as governmental powers, and certainly a power to destroy the government itself had never been known as a governmental, as a merely administrative power. This relative matter of national power and state rights as a principle is no other than the principle of generality and locality. Whatever concerns the whole should be confided to the whole, to the general government, while whatever concerns only the state should be left exclusively to the state. This is all there is of original principle about it. It may well be questioned whether there is today a majority of the legally qualified voters of any state, except perhaps South Carolina, in favor of disunion. There is much reason to believe that the Union men are the majority in many, if not in every other one of the so-called seceded states. The contrary has not been demonstrated in any one of them. It is ventured to affirm this even of Virginia and Tennessee, for the result of an election held in military camps where the bayonets are all on one side of the question voted upon can scarcely be considered as demonstrating popular sentiment. At such an election, all that large class who are at once for the Union and against coercion would be coerced to vote against the Union. Our adversaries have adopted some declarations of independence in which, unlike the good old one penned by Jefferson, they omit the words, "all men are created equal." Why? They have adopted a temporary national constitution, in the preamble of which, unlike our good old one signed by Washington, they omit "we the people," and substitute "we the deputies of the sovereign and independent states." Why? Why this deliberate pressing out of view the rights of men and the authority of the people? This is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. Yielding to partial and temporary departures from necessity, this is the leading object of the government for whose existence we contend. I am most happy to believe that the plain people understand and appreciate this. It is worthy of note that while in this, the government's hour of trial, large numbers of those in the Army and Navy who have been favored with the offices have resigned and proved false to the hand which had pampered them, not one common soldier or common sailor is known to have deserted his flag. Our popular government has often been called an experiment. 2 points in it our people have already settled: the successful establishing and the successful administering of it. One still remains: its successful maintenance against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it. It is now for them to demonstrate to the world that those who can fairly carry an election can also suppress a rebellion, that ballots are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets, and that when ballots have fairly and constitutionally decided, there can be no successful appeal back to bullets, that there can be no successful appeal except to ballots themselves at succeeding elections. As a private citizen, the executive could not have consented that these institutions shall perish. Much less could he, in betrayal of so vast and so sacred a trust as these free people have confided to him. He felt that he had no moral right to shrink, nor even to count the chances of his own life in what might follow. In full view of his great responsibility, he has so far done what he has deemed his duty. You will now, according to your own judgment, perform yours. President Lincoln's message was received not only with marks of approbation, but that clause of it which proposed to make the war short and decisive, and to raise an army of 400,000 men for the purpose, was greeted with hearty applause by the members on the floor. In this particular, they even exceeded the President's request. The new Army bill provided for the enlistment of volunteers for 3 years, unless sooner discharged, to a number not exceeding 500,000, besides authorizing the increase of the regular army by the addition of 11 new regiments, which the Government had already directed. The President was invested with authority to close insurrectionary ports of entry by proclamation, and a substantial carte blanche was given to the Secretary of the Navy to make a temporary increase in that branch of the service by authority to hire, purchase, or contract for vessels, and by the enlistment of the necessary seamen for 3 years or during the war to place them in a state of the utmost efficiency. The Secretary of State was allowed a large increase of consular representation at foreign ports. A considerable number of important amendments to existing laws were passed, which the recent conspiracy and insurrection suggested or made necessary. Express authority was given the President to collect duties on shipboard whenever such collection at ordinary places and by ordinary means should become impracticable. The Force Bill of 1795, which only provided for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, was amended so as to include authority to suppress rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. Conspiracy to overthrow the government of the United States or levy war against it was defined and made punishable. Important amendments were added to the law punishing piracy, and a new one passed to punish unlawful recruiting. For the purpose of weeding out any lurking sentiment of disaffection, every civil employee of the government was required to take the oath of allegiance anew. One of the principal duties of this new Congress was to provide the sinews of war. The strain to which the public credit had been subjected by the Buchanan administration had brought it to the verge of ruin. But the installation of a new president, pledged to perpetuate the government, maintain the Constitution, and enforce the laws, reassured the commercial as well as the political world. Secretary Chase, to feel the financial pulse, advertised 8 millions of the 6% bonds authorized by the Act of February 8, 1861. The response was highly gratifying. The total offers amounted to 27 millions, at bids ranging from 90% to par. His immediate predecessor, Secretary Dix, had sold 8 millions of the same loan 1 month before at a little less than 90.5. Determined to hold up the public credit to the highest possible point, Chase rejected all bids under 94, awarding, April 2, 1861, a total of $3,099,000 at an average of 94 and a fraction. The loss of the bids slightly under this figure he made up by negotiating a few days later $4,901,000 in Treasury notes at par and a slight premium. Before his next offer was advertised, the political convulsion had come. Sumter had fallen, and the national forces had been called out. With the advent of serious war and the beginning of expenditures apparently without limit, there was some danger that the government finances might collapse. But the national credit was buoyed up by the grand and almost unanimous patriotism of the North. On the 21st of May, Secretary Chase awarded another loan of $7,310,000, 6% bonds, at an average of a fraction above 85, and was at the same time able to negotiate $1,689,000 Treasury notes at par. From this point, he also began that policy of making his financial appeals directly to the public, which rendered his administration of the finances famous. Treasury notes were used at par in direct payment of public creditors and of official salaries, and some $2.5 million additional were made available in that form prior to the meeting of Congress. Favorable as the rates were in the usual contingency, these loans scarcely sufficed for the most pressing needs of the Treasury. It was necessary to call out the resources of the country upon a comprehensive system, and to an amount which, by comparison, dwarfed all previous government transactions to insignificance. President Lincoln's message asked that $400 million should be placed at the control of the government for the suppression of rebellion. Secretary Chase proposed to raise for the first fiscal year $80 million by taxes and $240 million by loans. Congress, in response, authorized a national loan of $250 million, levied on the various states and territories a direct tax of $20 million, and made provision by an increased tariff and an income tax for the remainder. While nearly all the Northern Democrats as well as the Republicans were earnestly supporting the war measures of the government, they nevertheless wished to avoid committing themselves to the political doctrines of the Republican Party, and the representatives from the border slave states naturally shared this desire. With this view, several members of the conservative minority from time to time offered resolutions to define the purpose and objects of the war, and such resolutions were generally framed in phraseology touching the slavery question, which was unpalatable to Republicans of extreme anti-slavery feelings. The Republican majority avoided committal on these propositions by parliamentary delay. But when the Battle of Bull Run took place and the full danger and disgrace of that defeat came to the knowledge of Congress, the spirit of partisanship gave way somewhat to the immediate desire and need of united support to the administration. In this new hour of trial, by common consent, Mr. Crittenden of Kentucky offered a resolution which embodied the controlling thought and purpose of the administration and the country. Resolved, etc., that the present deplorable civil war has been forced upon the country by the disunionists of the Southern States now in arms against the constitutional government and in arms around the Capitol, that in this national emergency, Congress, banishing all feelings of mere passion or resentment, will recollect only its duty to the whole country, that this war is not waged on their part in any spirit of oppression, or for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, of purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or established institutions of those states, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution, and to preserve the Union with all the dignity, equality, and rights of the several states unimpaired, and that as soon as these objects are accomplished, the war ought to cease. The resolution was adopted without debate, and with but 4 dissenting votes in the House. The same resolution was 2 days later offered in the Senate by Andrew Johnson, where it was debated at length and passed with but 5 dissenting votes, one of which was upon objections to mere phraseology. The resolution had a most important effect upon public opinion, curbing the excess of radical thought in the North, and reconciling the reactionary prejudice of the border slave states to the severe measures and sacrifices which the rebellion and the actual conflict of arms made it impossible longer to postpone. The agreement upon political theory expressed in this Crittenden resolution was, however, quickly found to be, like all generalities and compromises, difficult of application to practical questions springing up, particularly in military administration. In substance, the agreement might be defined to be that the border states would help prosecute the war if the war would refrain from touching slavery. But in making this agreement, both parties assumed a certain inconsistency. In the failure to discriminate between the slaves of loyal citizens and the slaves of rebels, each side placed itself in a false position. The inevitable need of both was as much to strike at the power which slavery gave the enemy as to protect the rights of loyal slaveholders. The same event which had compelled the union of votes for the Crittenden resolution also compelled the recognition of such a practical discrimination. On the day following the Battle of Bull Run, while the Crittenden resolution was being acted on by the House, The Judiciary Committee of the Senate reported an amendment to a pending bill to confiscate the property of rebels. The amendment provides, said Senator Trumbull, that if any person held to service or labor in any state under the laws thereof, by which of course is meant a slave in any of these states, is employed in aid of this rebellion, in digging ditches or entrenchments or in any other way, or if used for carrying guns, or if used to destroy this government by the consent of his master shall forfeit all right to him, and he shall be forever discharged. I understand that Negroes were in the fight which has recently occurred. I take it that Negroes who are used to destroy the Union and to shoot down the Union men by the consent of traitorous masters ought not to be restored to them. Nearly every senator from free states voted for this amendment. Those from the border states of Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri felt compelled to explain that they opposed the secondary and remote consequences of the declaration rather than the direct penalty. The senators from Delaware did not vote at all, and the bill as amended was at once passed without division. Substantially, the same feeling carried the bill through the House, with a slight change of phraseology. Read and referred there, it came up for debate within 2 weeks after the battle. Many members took part in the discussion, not in an obstructive spirit, but in the temper of true debate, which seeks to influence votes by substantial reasoning. Perhaps no member was listened to with such attention as Mr. Crittenden. His age, his unshaken loyalty, his position as mediator between the sections, his influence in and for Kentucky as a sort of keystone for compromise, gave his words great weight. But in opposing the measure, he could urge nothing against the justice of the penalty. He could only allege that it violated the Constitution and declare that he believed the policy inexpedient. To this, Thaddeus Stevens, the parliamentary leader of the Republicans, replied, "Sir, these rebels who have disregarded and set at defiance that instrument are by every rule of municipal and international law stopped from pleading it against our action. When a country is at open war with an enemy, every publicist agrees that you have the right to use every means which will weaken him. I do not believe that the free people of the North will stand by and see their sons and brothers and neighbors slaughtered by thousands and tens of thousands by rebels with arms in their hands, and forbear to call upon their enemies to be our friends." There was no need to enforce this sentiment by discussion. Several senators and representatives had gone within sight and sound of the Bull Run battlefield on that eventful Sunday. One representative was at that moment a prisoner of war in Richmond. The bill passed 60 to 48, one-third of the House not voting. The conservative nays contributing perhaps as much to its passage by a feeble opposition as the radical boldness of the yeas, who would not have had the strength to force its adoption against a determined resistance. Congress also legalized such of President Lincoln's war measures as had been taken without sanction of express law, but there was about the action a certain hesitation which robbed it of the grace of spontaneous generosity, and revealed, even at this early day, germs of faction among the supporters of the administration. On the third day of the session, a joint resolution was introduced in the Senate reciting the measures of extraordinary exigency, namely, the first call of the militia, the blockade, the call for 3 years volunteers, the increase of the regular Army and Navy, and the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, and declaring these several acts legal and valid. The resolution met but little direct opposition. Extremists like ex-Vice President John C. Breckinridge, who had not yet openly joined the rebellion, talked of usurpation. Border state conservatives argued that if the President's acts were illegal, no power of Congress could validate them. The Republicans chose rather a course of inaction, only a few openly refusing to vote for it, and those assigning different reasons. Some objected to the increase of the regular army, Others expressed their conviction that Congress alone possessed authority to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. The strongest underlying motive in both branches, perhaps, was an unwillingness to open a serious discussion which might interfere with the prompt disposal of such legislation as was immediately necessary, and which legislation would create no marked division of sentiment. In this way, the Senate resolution remained among the unfinished business, and the subject was left in abeyance until the prominent war measures were enacted. On the day before adjournment, a section was added to a bill for an increase of army pay, which, without making specific recitals, declared that all the acts, proclamations, and orders of the President relating to the militia or volunteers are hereby approved and in all respects legalized and made valid to the same intent and with the same effect as if they had been issued and done under the previous express authority and direction of the Congress of the United States. In this shape the act was passed with but slight opposition, and the special session adjourned on August 6, having in the period of a single month elaborated and passed a large number of very important laws, forming together a comprehensive and reasonably complete system of war legislation. End of chapter 21.